Rediscover your past by digitizing your family's memories with Legacy Box. Watch until the end of this video to find out more about preserving your legacy, and then visit legacybox.com/recollection. Back in the 1950s, it didn't matter if you were a kid or an adult. No one left the house without getting dressed in nice clothes. Men quite often wore a tie and hat around town, while women wore dresses. There was certainly no running to the grocery store in pajamas and slippers like we see today. Even the children were fully dressed in clothes that were designated for school, church, or even play. And for boys, shirts were always tucked in. Now, this doesn't mean that people didn't dress casually. It just means that outside of the home, families made sure to take pride in looking their best. When it came to entertainment, families were still turning to the large radio in their living room. Kids would gather in the evenings to catch the newest episode of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, The Lone Ranger, and The Adventures of Superman, among many others. These popular radio programs were also some of the first to be adapted for television. If you were lucky enough to have a TV in the 1950s, you may have been one of the first on your block. At the time, TVs had small black and white screens, but they were still the most amazing thing kids had ever seen up until that point. Parents during this time often married right out of high school, around the age of 18, but they still were firm in raising their children. Politeness and manners were often taught from a very young age, and having respect for adults was the most important part. Saying yes ma'am or no sir, looking people in the eye when speaking or being spoke to, and asking to be excused from the dinner table were common ways to show that you had good manners. This was long before cell phones and so-called social media distracted us from simply interacting with the people around us. Growing up, did you go to church on Sunday? For some children in the 1950s, going to church meant attending Sunday mornings, Wednesday evenings, and the occasional church potluck. As the population of the U.S. exploded with the baby boom, so did the numbers of people showing up in the church pews. The 1950s saw a record peak in church attendance, as families across the country made religion a priority. For students enrolled in public schools during the 1950s, expectations were much different than they are today. Graduation rates were much lower, as some young people quit school to begin working as teenagers. This was more prominent in rural areas, but in general, finishing high school was not viewed the same as it is today. Vocations were more of a focus, including automotive, woodshop, or homemaking. Access to higher education was much less, so only a small percentage of students went on to college. But if you did, it was much more affordable, and many graduates would work their way through school, paying as they went. Parents were very cautious when it came to the type of music kids listened to back in the 1950s. The gyrating hips of Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry were just too much, and it set off a moral panic in suburbs everywhere. The big band era had officially come to an end, as radio stations pumped out what some called the devil's music, but teenagers couldn't get enough of it. Meanwhile, parents did everything they could to prevent the kids from hearing, watching, or God forbid, dancing to rock and roll music. What they thought might be a passing fad evolved into the explicit lyrics and provocative performances that fill the world of music today. Children used to keep busy while they were inside the house, not by staring at phones or tablets, but by breaking out a board game like Monopoly, Mousetrap, or the Game of Life. Playing board games was also a family activity, and some would have a dedicated night to playing games together. Just think, you could buy a Parker Brothers or Milton Bradley board game for less than $2 back then. Plus, it spurred some good conversations and laughs in the process. While outside, kids came up with imaginative ways to pass the time. There were very few organized sports during this time, so the kids came up with their own ways to control outside games. They decided what, where, and when to play the games. They would then choose the captains, who in turn divided up the teams. Today's kids are inundated with organized sports that are often micromanaged by well-intentioned adults. But in the 1950s, it was less about becoming the very best ball player and more about having fun and developing friendships. And it was never about earning a trophy, especially just for participating like so many organizations do today. If you did have a new TV in the 1950s, one show that pretty much all the kids watched was the Howdy Doody Show. The show, produced by NBC, was a pioneer in children's programming and used puppets along with human characters like Buffalo Bob and Clarabelle the Clown. The show also featured a peanut gallery full of in-studio children watching live. As the show's intro, "It's Howdy Doody Time," began to play, all the kids would come running into the living room to watch. The show was so popular, Howdy Doody was a familiar face on merchandise and as a spokesperson in advertisements for show sponsors. During the mid-1950s, the computer revolution began, but not in the way kids today would recognize. Computers at this time filled an entire room and cost more than $15,000 per month just to rent, so only the largest companies in the US utilized them. They were mainly used for complex calculations and scientific functions only, and you might be surprised to learn that they only had memory capacity of about 10 kilobytes. That's equivalent to sending one email today. On Wednesday evenings, The Wonderful World of Disney was what everyone looked forward to. The anthology series was actually called Walt Disney's Disneyland in the 1950s, before it became The Wonderful World of Disney in the 1960s. This was a time when households were limited in choices of TV programming, but the Walt Disney hosted weekly special had families gathering around the TV to watch the likes of Davy Crockett and Johnny Tremaine. Many of these early TV movies were aired in segments over multiple weeks, and it gave the kids something to bond over at school. The coonskin cap craze was a result of the popularity of these weekly Disney TV movies. Before people would hop on an airplane to fly away on vacation, families were hitting the open road. The family road trip was made possible because the interstate system began to take shape during the 1950s, and traveling from state to state became much easier. In addition, gas stations, restaurants, and motels began to pop up along popular routes. Chains like Holiday Inn, Howard Johnson's, and Stuckey's became popular roadside stops as people traveled to vacation destinations, like down to Florida. Packing up the family car was always memorable, and the anticipation would always build after you spent a couple days on the road. There were always lots of great memories made on these family trips. Imagine waking up every single morning, putting on your wristwatch, and then having to wind it so that it kept the time. This is what most people did if they wore a watch, because battery-powered watches were still quite new, and they weren't widely available yet. This was also a time when learning to read a clock was essential, because they often only displayed hands that pointed to Roman numerals or tick marks. Today, you might be surprised to learn that there's a generation of kids that are unable to read analog clocks, because they have grown up never needing to. If we think about all the extremes we go to with pregnancy today, like no caffeine, no deli meat, making sure we take the right vitamins and supplements, and generally avoiding anything that might harm the baby. But back in the 1960s, mothers didn't change much about their lifestyle after becoming pregnant. If she smoked prior, then she most likely continued to smoke. And if she drank alcohol, well then that usually continued too. Of course our mothers weren't intentionally trying to hurt us, because the dangers of these habits weren't fully recognized. It is funny to look back at photo albums though, to see mom fully pregnant with a cigarette in her hand. During the 1960s, the most common way to get to school in the morning was to use your 2 feet and get walking. There was no carpool, and it didn't matter that you were only 6. We were sent off to school on our own and taught how to find our way. Sometimes you tagged along with siblings or a neighborhood kid who walked the same route. So you weren't always totally alone, but parents didn't hesitate to hand you your lunch and send you on your way.
Today, very few kids still walk. They either ride the bus or their parents find the time to wait in long lines just to drop off and pick up kids. Have you seen some of the car lines at schools these days? One of the great things about walking home from school is that you could always make a pit stop at a store for some candy. Back then, a bit of loose change could get you a nice-sized bag of candy. You could also hang out and get an ice cream soda, a malt, or an egg cream, and you could straddle up to the counter and drink it just like a grown-up. From an early age, kids learned about earning, counting, and spending real money, which is something lost on kids today. Now kids seem to think that plastic credit cards are the only way to pay for things. During the 1960s, toys came with a bit of risk. From science experiment kits that gave off toxic fumes to plastic melting ovens like the Thing Maker, kids learned early that life was dangerous and you had to be careful when using certain toys. Back then, a BB gun was considered a toy and everybody wanted one. Today, toys that pose a choking hazard are pulled from store shelves, but kids in the 1960s were built differently. They didn't mind the burns, scrapes, and scars. They were seen as badges of honor. In the 1960s, backpacks weren't a thing yet, so kids would carry their school books in their hands or under their arms as they walked to school. So not only did they walk to and from school, but they lugged around textbooks, folders, and papers in their sweaty mitts rather than having the luxury of a bag they could strap on their shoulders. It would take until the 1970s before backpacks became a thing. Watching movies was a different experience in the 1960s. There was no instant access to popular movies. We had to wait for them. That's because local downtown theaters only had 1 or 2 screens, and the movies would rotate out every week or two. For most of us, there were no multiplexes showing every single recently released movie, and malls were just coming into existence. We did, however, have drive-in theaters, which gave us another option for catching a movie on the weekend. One thing about the 1960s that would shock young men and women today was the military draft. With the Vietnam War raging throughout the decade, young men that were 18 would be drafted into the Army to fight in one of the most difficult wars on record. There were some who dodged the draft, but by and large, that generation of young men stepped up, served, and for some, gave up their life to defend their country. Can you imagine if there was a draft imposed on today's young people? Although Americans still have to make sure to register with the Selective Service, lucky for them, the draft has not been needed ever since. Remember the joy kids felt when they cracked open the red egg that contained silly putty? You could bounce it or stretch it, and the fascination with using it on newsprint to make an exact copy of your favorite comics was priceless. They do still sell silly putty, but very few households even have newspapers lying around, and kids today certainly aren't reading the comic strips, so the popularity of silly putty is nothing like it was back in the 1960s. With TV programming still being fairly new, the idea of watching TV while eating dinner was a breakthrough for the Swanson Company. The first TV dinner came in a divided foil container that you heated up in the oven, and they became a fixture in family freezers across the country. The novelty of it made Swanson TV dinners huge, and other companies began to offer their own versions. The idea was especially popular with working moms, and it became a staple of the middle-class American family. This was as close to having pre-prepared food delivered to your home as you could get, because there were no food delivery options at the time. Can you imagine? Speaking of food, the 60s offered some foods that would turn the stomach of many young people today. Jell-O now is just a dessert, but back then it was an entire meal. Our moms experimented with putting anything in Jell-O, and I mean anything. If you find a cookbook from the 1960s, you can bet it's going to have some type of ham, vegetable, or fish gelatin mold in it. And if you had a mom that made you finish your dinner before leaving the table, well then, you were probably going to be there for a while. If you grew up in the 1960s, Westerns were everything to a young boy. John Wayne was starring in motion pictures, and shows like Gunsmoke and Bonanza were what you were watching on TV. Bonanza was also the very first Western that was broadcast in color, so it was always fun to find someone in the neighborhood who had a color TV. And if you weren't watching Bonanza, you were outside with your cowboy hat or coonskin cap on and a cap gun strapped to your side. Not sure the last time I saw a kid playing outside with a cap gun, but in the 1960s, all of us did. Getting your first job in the 1960s meant that you were paid a whopping $1 to $1.50 per hour. This was still a big achievement, and meant that you could now earn some spending money that exceeded the change collected from returning cans and bottles. For teenagers during this time, a minimum wage job was more than just earning money. It taught them how to be a good employee that started with wearing a clean and pressed uniform, being punctual, and working hard. The last time I was at McDonald's, the sign read $15 per hour starting pay. The employees, however, were wearing street clothes, and I waited 20 minutes for the wrong order. Options for watching TV were very different during the 1970s. For one, there were really only 3 TV channels plus public broadcasting. That's right, just 3. No streaming services, no endless options. You'd also have to get up and manually turn the dial to change channels. It was a time in which we waited for our favorite shows, which included nightly shows that were popular and Saturday morning cartoons. It was a big deal when you could pour a big bowl of cereal and binge hours of your favorite animated shows. But with the limited options on the television, it's no wonder kids spent so much time outside. Well, that and the fact that some parents made their kids go outside and play. During the 70s, making a mixtape was an art form. It took patience and dedication to sit by the radio for hours, waiting for the right song to be played. It didn't matter how good your timing was either, because pushing down the play and record buttons at precisely the right time still sometimes had the DJ talking over the intro. And that was just part of the charm. Cassettes had their quirks too, like when they got tangled, and you would have to use a pencil to wind them back in. Cassettes made it pretty easy to create what we know today as a playlist, and this was the first time we could listen anywhere we wanted. Did you ever run around the house and pretend you were Superman or Batman? Well, if you did during the 1970s, then you most likely had on a pair of superhero underoos. For many kids, they served a dual purpose. They were underwear and part of a costume when you were strutting around the house, feeling invincible. Superhero underoos were more than just clothing. They were your identity, especially the ones that matched the actual superhero outfits. Nowadays, kids can never appreciate their underwear in the same way. During the 1970s, record stores were not just places to buy music. They were social gathering spots. Just like the mall of the 1980s, young people would hang out with friends, browse through vinyl records, and even listen to albums before they purchased them. Store employees at this time were also music enthusiasts, and they would recommend hidden gems. It also wasn't uncommon for you to strike up a conversation with a stranger who was into the same music as you. So the local record store was a special place, and yet another experience that is hard to replicate today. Hitchhiking during the 1970s was surprisingly easy and acceptable. It was very common to see people thumbing a ride on the side of the road. Drivers would often not hesitate to pick up hitchhikers, and it was seen as a way to help out a fellow traveler. There was more of a sense of camaraderie on the open road back then, and that's hard to understand in today's world. But it wasn't without risk, and there was still a chance you might encounter a few weirdos, and that was just part of the fun. Nowadays, it's illegal to hitch free rides in many places, but back then, it wasn't unusual to find a service member, a student, or even a hippie thumbing for a ride. When you think back to the 1970s, men had some serious style. They had manly mustaches, sideburns, big hair, and that distinct aroma of aftershave wafting around them. It was all about the macho look, and men took their grooming pretty seriously. This was also coupled with some pretty bold choices in clothing too, and as long as you could leave a couple of buttons undone so you could show off your hairy chest, you were good to go. Nothing quite matches the swagger men had in the 1970s. And speaking of grooming, Ladies, too, had their own unique products to give them that 1970s look. Sun-In was all the rage, promising sun-kissed highlights. Women would spray it into their hair and head outside hoping for those perfect golden locks. And who doesn't remember the smell of Love's Baby Soft, a signature scent from the 1970s? The sweet, youthful fragrance was a defining smell that had all the girls wearing Baby Soft. But I'm not sure the ad campaign would fly today. When the telephone that hung in the kitchen rang, it was always answered. This was before caller ID, so people had no idea who was calling. Can you imagine? You didn't know if it was your best friend or a sales call, which meant there was a chance that you might recognize the voice on the other end and spend some time getting twisted up in the phone cord while you talked. Or you might be yelling across the house to let someone else know the call was for them. Today's kids might find it unbelievable that we willingly picked up the phone without the slightest clue as to who was on the other end. To best capture the moments in the 1970s, you absolutely needed a Polaroid camera. The idea of hitting the button and instantly getting a picture developed was gratifying, but you had to be selective because each roll of film only had a certain number of pictures. And then there was the practice of shaking the picture to help it develop faster, which was just a myth. But you couldn't take the bulky Polaroid camera with you everywhere, so there were also photo booths that were strategically placed where teenagers congregated. Places like arcades, malls, and roller rinks were ideal, so best friends and couples could capture the day with a series of goofy and fun pictures. If you were to step back in time and visit a 1970s kitchen, you'd probably find a fair share of mushroom-themed decor. Mushroom plates, mushroom curtains, mushroom wallpaper. They were everywhere. Everything back then seemed to have an earthy aesthetic, and mushrooms must have been the perfect fungus to represent that style. I guess you'd call it charm, and every corner of the room seemed to be inspired by it. As you waited for the weekend and that special morning of cartoons, you also needed a sugary cereal to help you enjoy it. The 1970s was all about finding the best surprise toy inside the cereal box. Kids would beg their parents for a certain brand of cereal, not because of the taste, but because of the toy. It may have been a silly game or a small figurine, but it was like finding a treasure when you dug down to the bottom of the box and pulled out the prize. This excitement made morning cereal more than just breakfast, which is much different than today. Opening a beer or soda can in the 1970s was a bit different than what we are used to today. You'd pull the ring back and peel back the aluminum tab. And back then, most of the tabs were just tossed on the ground. These sharp pieces of discarded metal were a nuisance, especially on beaches or places where you might walk barefoot. These pull tabs were just another hazard that we faced, and the tops would change shortly after to the more familiar stay tab that we recognize today. But it was still all part of the fun of living in the 1970s. School lunch in the 1970s wasn't complete without a trusty metal lunchbox and the matching thermos. These lunchboxes not only showed off our favorite characters from pop culture, but they often also had their fair share of rust on them too. Any ding or scratch would quickly rust over, and our parents didn't seem to mind either. Remember the smell of opening a metal lunchbox after a long, hot day? Kids today, with their ice packs and insulated lunch bags, will never fully understand what it was like to grow up in the 1970s. The use of technology in schools varies greatly when we think back to the 1980s. They of course had overhead projectors, which allowed the teacher to project transparent sheets onto a screen, which allowed them to work through problems or worksheets as a whole class, essentially replacing the need for a blackboard. But when we think of classroom technology today, kids have iPads and laptops that they carry around with them all the time. Back in the 1980s, you were lucky if there was one giant computer somewhere in the classroom, or a special computer room you would go to that was used by the whole school. The days you could play on the computer was always a treat because it meant you could play the Oregon Trail. For some, this was the first memory of using a computer, and it certainly was memorable, especially since you were usually killed off before you made it to Oregon. Kids today have access to more entertainment than they could ever dream of consuming.
When new movies come out, you can stream them instantly, and you don't even have to beg your parents. In the 1980s, the closest thing to on-demand was waiting all week to head to the video store. This was after you waited months for the movie to be released on VHS. Then when you would head over to the new release section at your local video store, there's a good chance all the copies were already rented, and you had to wait even longer. There was still nothing better than making that weekly trip to rent movies, and leaving with a stack of VHS tapes that would fill your weekend. Oh yeah, and you also had to remember to rewind the movies before you return them to the store. Within the last few years, the need for fidget toys has become almost a necessity for kids, as if sitting still for a bit is torture. Kids today have to constantly be fiddling, spinning, or clicking buttons in order to survive the day. The closest thing we had to a fidget spinner was the Rubik's Cube. This puzzle game had you twisting blocks in order to complete each side's color. It required thought and strategy to even come close, but there was also a book you could buy which helped you learn how to solve the puzzle. Aside from the Rubik's Cube, there were also these helicopter seeds that would fall from the trees. I guess picking them up, tossing them in the air, and watching them twirl back down to earth over and over again could be considered fidgeting back in the day. Whenever a disaster strikes today, you seem to always see a GoFundMe page or some other crowdfunding app that is meant to ease the financial burden. But in the 1980s, music was how we raised money for the needy. Songs like Do They Know It's Christmas and We Are the World gathered the decade's biggest stars to perform a charity single that raised money to combat the famine happening in Ethiopia. On top of that, there were also opportunities through television commercials to sponsor children in impoverished countries. For just $11 a month, you believed you were making a difference in the world. The fantasy genre in the 1980s was drastically different than what we see today. With CGI and advances in special effects, franchises like Harry Potter, Avatar, and Game of Thrones look unbelievably real. Maybe that's why cosplay is so popular even for adults. But in the 1980s, you never saw anyone walking around as their favorite character from The Dark Crystal or The Never-Ending Story. These movies used puppets and animatronics that were pretty crude, so you never truly felt immersed in that world. There was Star Wars, which was the most convincing, but it's really nothing like the newer Star Wars films developed today. Instead, we had David Bowie, basically dressed as a 1970s version of himself in the 1986 movie Labyrinth. The 1980s was a revolution in video games being brought to the masses. This is the decade when kids moved away from heading to the arcade and chose to stay home and play their very own Atari, Commodore 64, or Nintendo Entertainment System. It was exhilarating when you opened up that birthday or Christmas present and saw a Nintendo logo, and kids today may never know that feeling. However, video games were large cartridges, and they occasionally needed special treatment before they could be played. Nintendo games like Duck Hunt and The Legend of Zelda may have needed the dust blown out before you could get it to load. If that didn't work, you might also have to try inserting the cartridge in different ways to get it to start. Today, games live online, and video game consoles are just computers that connect to the internet, and they give you instant access to any game you want to play. Oh yeah, and the controllers are wireless now, so you don't have to sit within 6 feet of the television to play a game. During the 1980s, rainbows were not a statement about your sexuality. It was just a colorful way to accessorize an outfit. Who didn't wear the standard 1980s flip-flops with rainbow straps? There were also the occasional set of suspenders or a belt that added a pop of color to any toddler outfit. We also had Punky Brewster, Rainbow Bright, and even Reading Rainbow, which pretty much every kid in the 1980s grew up watching. Today, the world of music is large, and kids have endless options when it comes to finding their favorite musician, from rap to country, Disney Channel pop stars to YouTubers. But in the 1980s, there were really just two megastars in the world of music, Michael Jackson and Madonna. For Michael Jackson, it was his Thriller album from 1982, which became the best-selling album of all time. For Madonna, it was her Like a Virgin album in 1984, which had just enough bad girl edge to it that teenagers went crazy for it. Both artists built careers off the success they had in the 1980s, and they remain icons to this day. The fast food experience in the 1980s was all about the promotions. I mean, who didn't have a set of Smurf glasses in their kitchen cupboard? Not only was the food affordable back then, but you got a ton of free stuff too. From 3D glasses and toys to California raisins and Muppet Babies, McDonald's, Burger King, and Hardee's were always offering up the coolest promo to get you in the door. Even Pizza Hut had promotional drinkware with the release of E.T. in 1982. And who could forget the Noid figures you could pick up at Domino's in the 1980s. Today, the influence that movies and pop culture have on fast food choices is pretty non-existent. And on top of that, inflation is about the only thing on the menu these days. Just like with movies and video games, streaming services give viewers control when it comes to watching their favorite show. But during the 80s, TV shows were a weekly event that aired on a specific channel at a specific time. So if you missed it, you were out of luck. That's why it was so important to consult the TV guide or the listings available in the newspaper if you wanted to watch something. Most people had a favorite night for watching TV, and that led to networks blocking their most popular shows into one night. NBC's must-see TV, although it wouldn't be called that until the 1990s, was Thursday nights, anchored by The Cosby Show, and TGIF became ABC's Big Friday night, with shows like Full House and Perfect Strangers. If you didn't have a VCR set to record your favorite shows, then you were at the mercy of catching reruns, which might mean months of waiting. Making phone calls, just like writing letters, was how we communicated with people during the 1980s. This was before texting, FaceTime, and smartphones. There were 3 types of calls you could make. A local call, which you would make to friends. A long-distance expensive call, which you waited until after 7 p.m. to make because it was cheaper. And then the collect call, when you wanted the other party to pay for it. The collect call meant dialing the operator first to provide the phone number and your name. They would then call the other person and see if they would accept the charges before they would connect the call. Phone bills were a big part of the 1980s, and it was easy to rack up a huge bill if you weren't careful. Today, we don't even think about phone charges, except when we are adding new lines to our family plan. One of the overarching themes of the 1980s was saying no to drugs. The Just Say No campaign was spearheaded by First Lady Nancy Reagan and was promoted through public events, public service announcements, and even incorporated into TV programming like Different Strokes and Punky Brewster. There was also the DARE program, which had popular shirts that read "Dare" to keep kids off drugs. These programs targeted street drugs in the 1980s, but if they were relaunched today, they would most certainly be aimed at prescription drugs and the pharmaceutical companies that run non-stop ads on just about every platform. Recollection Road and Legacy Box both believe it's important to preserve the past. If you're like me, there's a box of your family's treasured home movies and photos tucked away somewhere, and Legacy Box can help you preserve them digitally. The process is a simple and safe solution for converting your home movies and photos to thumb drive or to the cloud. Just send in your Legacy Box filled with old VHS and camcorder tapes, film reels, and pictures, and get back digital copies that can be easily enjoyed, shared, and kept organized. It's that easy. Legacy Box is trusted by over 1 million people, and it's all done right here in the USA. Get started preserving your past today. Go to legacybox.com/recollection to get an incredible 55% off. Buy today to take advantage of this exclusive offer and send in your memories when you're ready. Go to legacybox.com/recollection to save 55% while supplies last. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything, and make sure to check the description of this video for links to pick up a t-shirt and sign up for the newsletter. Thank you to our loyal Patreon supporters listed here. Visit patreon.com/recollectionroad to join the club.